I'm really pleased to introduce Laura. So Laura Bourgeau-Chavez is a research scientist at Michigan Tech Research Institute, or MTRI for short. Laura has been studying wetlands and upland landscape ecosystems using remote sensing and field data for over 25 years. Her expertise is in using radar imagery either alone or in combination with optical and or Lidar systems. And that's to detect and monitor wetland type, extent, inundation patterns, soil moisture, and more. Laura is going to present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. So thank you, Laura, for sharing your work and time with us.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to present today. So I'm going to be talking, well, the title is Monitoring Lake Superior Coastal Wetlands with High Resolution Satellite Imagery and Hydrological Modeling. My collaborators at Michigan Tech are Mike Battaglia, Andrew Poley, Mary Ellen Miller, Dorothy Leisman, and Jeremy Graham. And then, of course, we have partners at Environment Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and in Minnesota, Shared Geo, as well as University of Minnesota. And the bulk of what I'm presenting is funded under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative through the Fish and Wildlife Service. So what I'm going to be presenting, I'm going to start, and it was good to know that a lot of novices there. So kind of looking at optical versus radar imagery for monitoring wetlands and detecting change. And then just so that we're all kind of have the same understanding of the differences, then I'll get into some of the things that we've been doing with wetland type mapping and looking at change, as well as invasive plant species. In that, I'll show a comparison of differences in resolution, which is something that Aaron said would be of interest. So we've mapped from half-acre minimum mapping unit down to sub-meter minimum mapping unit. So we'll show a little bit of comparison there. And then application of this data to adaptive management in Saginaw Bay for invasive Phragmites. Just a little touch on that a little bit so you can see what we can do with that high resolution imagery. And then a lot of the work we've been doing more recently is looking at surface water and inundation extent monitoring, as well as hydrologic connectivity modeling for assessment of wetland gain and loss, which is one of the metrics that the EPA needs to report out on. And then recently we've been applying some of the products with the shorebird breeding habitat. That's very preliminary work I'm going to be showing, and it's with a student from University of Michigan. So I'm sure most of you know the importance of coastal wetlands and monitoring in their dynamic systems, and you can see in this figure, which is from Landsat, from Google Earth Engine, the changes through time starting in 1984, and this will just cycle through. Saginaw Bay there is an expansion of Phragmites. With this resolution of this imagery, you can't really see all of the wetlands that are actually there. So they may have been very sparse in some of these scenes, but once the frag hits, it just gets very visible with Landsat. But we know that even small changes to hydrology can lead to large shifts in these ecosystems, which is causing that Phragmites expansion. And over half of the Great Lakes coastal wetlands have been converted to agriculture or other development, and it's really important to maintain the health of these remaining wetlands for the overall health of the Great Lakes, as well as ecosystem services and habitat. And monitoring is really key to management and early warnings. For Lake Superior, the LAMP objective calls out maintaining coastal wetlands in good ecological condition and protecting and enhancing the habitat. And they specifically mention some of our sites that are a focus of our project, the Bad River and the St. Louis River Estuary. So this is again just showing coastal wetlands are dynamic as the water levels go up. We have a shift of wetlands towards the land, and as they go down, it shifts back towards the water. And so we need to keep this in mind when we're looking at change, because some of it is temporary or natural versus something that is more permanent change. So just an overview of this project that we've been working on since 2016. It has all these partners and really bringing together their expertise to build some tools for monitoring wetland condition change going on. And the focus is on using Worldview 2 multispectral data, which has primarily what we use has about a 60 centimeter resolution. And then RadarSat 2, which is a Canadian system. It's a C-band sensor, which is about 5.7 centimeter wavelength, and it has 5 to 8 meter resolution. So our approach is to build on past wetland research, and we work together as well as separately building methods to come together and try to make those automated or semi-automated. Some of the things I'm going to be presenting today are on that are things that are specifically called out in this project: the surface water extent, vegetation, inundation extent. Water level changes I'm not going to talk about today. It's actually kind of problematic with C-band. But for the most part, the Canadians are working on that. And then the wetland type change. So just getting into the difference between optical and radar sensors, or it says SAR here, that synthetic aperture radar. So just this is over Bad River showing a natural color composite from Worldview versus RadarSat 2 on the bottom. And typically with the RadarSat, we'll put these bands, it has 4 bands, and we'll put them in this order. And what it does is that the middle band, HV, is very sensitive to biomass, and putting that in the green band for the red, green, blue composite makes the higher biomass areas look green. HH is sensitive to moisture condition, and VV is also to some degree. So you can see some variation in the wetland area of Bad River, coming out orange and blues. And what you're seeing with the Worldview data is nanometer wavelengths, and that's similar to what you see with your eye, but it also goes into the infrared. And what the reflectance is really depends on features at the cellular level. So whether or not there's chlorophyll, or if it's changing color due to senescence, leaf moisture, and then the background depends on what the surface is, what the soil type is, if there's water, standing water or not. But usually you can't see through the vegetation to see the water, and clouds are a real problem. The SAR, on the other hand, is much longer, centimeters long, and it's able to penetrate a vegetation canopy to a degree depending on the wavelength, and you can detect inundation and water level patterns, the structure of the vegetation, the biomass, as well as soil moisture, and it's all weather. And we receive from our pilot sites, which I'll show you in a minute, we receive RadarSat 2 every 24 days, and it's pretty on schedule. There's not a problem with clouds, but sometimes we get bumped for other projects. The Worldview, some years we get a lot of data, some years we're lucky if we get one. There have been years that we haven't gotten any from most of our sites, so it's kind of a problem relying just on that. So this is just theoretical, showing the scattering. So radar sends out its own energy source, and what comes back depends on what it interacts with. So the top are flooded conditions and the bottom are non. And you can see, I think you can probably see my arrow. Without the L band up here is showing that it penetrates the forest and then bounces to hit the water and back. We call that double bounce. And most of the energy comes back that was sent out. And we get a really bright return from that. That also occurs with C-band, which we're using in this project for cattail in particular, but other emergent wetlands vegetation, except in a lot of cases, Phragmites is just too dense. L-band also works for detecting, well, Phragmites and shrubby wetlands as well. So C-band is more lower biomass, L-band is higher, but there haven't been as many available. So talking about that double bounce that you get in C-band from the lower biomass vegetation, you can see that in this HH image from RadarSat 2 over Bad River. So all these, it appears in the image as this really bright, strong return. So looking at the sensors that are available, or have been in the past, there's been a lot of C-band on the top here you can see, and a lot of them were openly available. RadarSat 2 is actually commercial, but we receive it through the grant, through NGA. It's going to be replaced soon by the RadarSat Constellation mission, which is more open, but does not collect the same mode that RadarSat 2 did. Sentinel-1 is freely available. And then the L-band has been more problematic. There was ALOS Pulsar back that 2006 to 2011. That was openly available. The second one is commercial and hard to get. And then NASA has plans to launch one. So in the future, we'll have improved capability for monitoring with the L-band radar in this region, and it'll be freely available, and everything will be saved that's collected. So these are the study sites on Lake Superior that we've been monitoring since 2017, and Duluth actually since 2016. So we have the St. Louis River Estuary, Bad River, Houghton, and then Whitefish Point. So, and all of the maps that we make have this same key. Phragmites is shown in purple. Of course, there's not much up in Superior, which is a good thing. Typha, cattail is pink in all of them. Chenoplectus or sparse vegetation is this lighter purple color, and emergent wetland is blue. Aquatic bed is pale blue. And then we have peatland classes, as well as wetland and wetland shrub and forested wetland. Just so these were the original 2016 sites in the red boxes, and we continue to collect data from all of these as well, and some of these might pop up in the presentation. So looking at wetland type change and invasive species, our goal is to use the RadarSat 2 and the worldview from multiple seasons. That's the best method to map, to create annual high resolution maps. And then we're looking to enhance methods to detect invasive and threatened wetland plant species. So things like wild rice we've been looking at trying to detect, but we don't have a whole lot of data on where it is. Invasive Phragmites, we have tons of data, so focus on that as well as cattail. And the ultimate goal is to develop semi-automated methods. And this is probably the most difficult one to do that for. Right now, it really requires a human intervention in the whole process. And, and using, again, that RadarSat 2 and the worldview imagery, and the worldview has 8 bands. So I haven't mentioned that. So the radar has 4. It's polarized data. So it sends out horizontal, receives horizontal. That's what HH stands for. VV sends out vertical, receives vertical, and then the 2 in the middle are called cross poles. So they send out one and receive the opposite. And those are sensitive to biomass because the more energy that comes back in the opposite polarization, the more biomass it's interacted with on the ground. So some of the things that the worldview imagery have that's maybe very helpful is like the red edge and the near IR bands, and it's also sub-meter resolution. So looking at RadarSat 2 for Bad River, we're showing here the 3 different dates of RadarSat 2, and in the comparison map in the bottom left is actually from Pulsar and from a 2010 map, just to show what the ecosystem types were mapped there previously. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to get to the site. We were going to go last year to a bunch of the sites, and because of COVID, we weren't able to go there. So what I'm showing you for this site was either assumed based on Whitefish Point peatlands that we've been to, both open sedge, shrubby, and forested fens, primarily there with deep peat, or from what was mapped previously, or image interpretation from the high resolution data. So just to go through this a little bit to show you what the differences are, this is the April 24th, 2017 image, and when the vegetation would not have yet emerged for the most part. And I'm looking at May, and the colors change, and it's because moisture's changing, the vegetation's changing. And then there's June. And you can see as you progress, this is the peak, getting to the peak season. And between those, you can see a lot of growth in the streams here, which is probably floating aquatic. And then looking through time, which is what we typically do to make the maps. We use 3 seasons. Usually we try to use spring, summer, fall. I think when this year, maybe we didn't have a fall one to put in here, but you can see differences of blue areas, yellow areas, green areas that are clearly differences in moisture patterns in these different sites. And then if you do the same thing with the cross pole, you can see differences in biomass across these. So using these together with worldview imagery, we've produced a map from 2017. And this, what's labeled here is Chenoplectus in the center here. It's probably just a really wet area of the fen. So we haven't been here to check it out, but if anyone has knowledge of this area, we'd be happy to hear about it. And we're hoping this summer to get there. Then we made a similar map from the 2018 data set, but again, haven't been there for either of these. So for Duluth, this original map was made before we had been there, but we had gotten data from people in the region, and it used, again, the spring, summer, and fall worldview data, but we didn't have any spring or radar sat this year, and so it used 3 dates later in the season to produce this map. And we did visit here in 2017 and then went back in and improved the map based on our field data. We also tried to use the radar sat alone, since that is a little bit more consistent data set, and often we don't get any from worldview. So this is on the right, looking at using radar sat 2 alone, and on the left, adding in just 1 date of worldview. And it improves it. It gets to the red are urban, are developed classes. And you can see they're kind of scattered in the bottom of the radar alone one, and they get eliminated with the single date. So obviously using both is an improvement, but we can do a kind of decent job defining wetlands with the radar alone. So this is the 2019 one that was just produced. And there is some frag noted here. So it's the purple up in the right image, and you can clearly see it in the worldview scene. So once we get some validation for this, then we can start to look at change between the images. Houghton is another one. We have a preliminary map here. We had planned to collect field data. These are the points we had, and so we would do this for each one, select some points in the different types kind of randomly that we should get to in order to train and validate it a little bit. So this one is kind of cool because it has the dune and swale complexes. Whitefish Point is a place we did get to, and so this shows the change between the 2 dates, and there's not a whole lot of change. Most of what we're seeing is, and these probably aren't as connected to the Great Lakes, even though the Great Lakes water levels have gone up. It looks like from the map of the vegetation here, we have an increase in denser wetland, which is the blue emergent wetland, and in the top one, and a decrease in what's shown here as Chenoplectus or sparse emergent. So you're really seeing an increase in the density of that, which indicates to me that the water level is dropping. And then also in the bottom one, you have a decrease in the aquatic bed and an increase. So same kind of thing. The aquatic bed changes to emergent wetland, and the water level is usually going down. But for the most part, there's not a whole lot of change. It's only 2-year difference. We did see, just jumping down to Lake Chanot Islands, we had 2-year difference there. We actually saw big changes there. Oops, there it goes. So Duck Bay at the top and Shepherd Bay, you can see between 2016 is on the left and 2018 is on the right. you see a decrease in the wetland shrub, and it's probably flooding out, and then the emergent is coming in, taking over. And then in the bottom ones, there's a big problem here with Eurasian water milfoil, and we're actually also able to map that, although I'm not showing details of that in this presentation. But you can see a lot of changes going down in the marina and the Flowers Bay. And then just to show the difference between the moderate and high resolution monitoring, on the left is that Landsat Pulsar, which is really a half acre minimum mapping unit. The resolution of the Landsat is 30 meter, shown on the left. And there is 6 years difference between these two, but you can just see the level of detail that you're able to resolve using the RadarSat-2 and WorldView, just a world of difference. And then looking again at Bad River, the difference between on the left, that Landsat Pulsar, and on the right, the RadarSat-2 and WorldView. So again, just an increase in the level of detail. But we have to work on training that Bad River one to make it a little bit better. So I think, speaking of Phragmites and using this monitoring for adaptive management, we actually use WorldView alone in this case. And treatments occurred at a bunch of sites there, herbicide treatment and mowing after that. And so we mapped before treatment where the frag was. Again, it's purple in these, dark purple. And then post-treatment, a year after treatment, we mapped it again, and you can see there's still some Phragmites in places. So the SISMA there used these estimates of where the Phragmites was to go back and have it helicopter sprayed in a couple of these cases, and then where there were smaller patches, they went in and did some hand spraying, backpack spraying. So we actually mapped all of Saginaw Bay using the WorldView data for a related project. And there's so much effort there going on for treatment that this is a baseline map for them to use. Of course, there's changes going on, but at least they know where to focus efforts. And that's available on our web viewer that also has the 30-meter map. And just another example, zooming into, this is called Hampton Pre-Treatment. We actually had both frag, and then we had a mixed frag class here, as well as some standing dead frag that was mapped. And so that's pre-treatment on the top, and on the bottom, after treatment, you can clearly see where the dead frag is. It's brown in the bottom one, and that's shown as gray in the right one. But there's still some frag that was missed in a couple of spaces, maybe because it was too close to this forest or out on the water's edge. And then there's a little bit mixed as well. So they then went in and mowed this area, and you can see from the image clearly, after it was partially mowed, after the winter, the water came in, and a lot of the dead stems you can see along the edge, kind of on the coast. And what this site looked like before, this is like going through this transect 518 CB before. It was so dense you couldn't barely see the person in front of you. I was out there after when it looked like the image on 2018 image, and looking back towards the pier, it looked like it's a case where it worked, where the treatment worked. There's it looks like a nice wetland complex, and you can see the trees along the pier there, and also a patch of the standing dead frags still there. So using this pre-treatment and post-treatment approach, as well as field sampling, shown here is just the results of the WorldView data. You can see pre-treatment percent frag for the study areas, post-treatment, and then the change. And it was considered a decrease of 70% was successful. And you can see all these are greater than 70%, except for Callahan, which is an old farm field, which has been a real problem. We had to treat it again, I think last year or the year before. So we'll be following up with that with the new grant that we got. So semi-automating these is really a challenge. I mentioned already that the optical imagery is not always available. And then we have been looking at working on radiometric change between anniversary date worldview images, but if there's not one available or they're one spring and one summer, that's really not going to work. But we can demonstrate that for some of them, and that could be automated. And with more satellites collecting data more frequently, like Planet, that could be something that we could do into the future. We're also looking at the mapping with RadarSat-2 alone, since it's more reliable. And I'll show an example for the black tern where we're working to develop a method where we can kind of automate it a little bit. And then looking to the future, the RadarSat constellation mission is not fully polarimetric, so we need to develop new methods for that. So that's kind of a problem looking to the future, but so I'm going to shift now to the inundation monitoring. And this is automated for surface water extent. We just use that cross pull from the RadarSat-2, which is shown in the left for Duluth. And then we threshold between land and water. It's automated. It just does a PDF of the whole image. And then we find the low point between the two peaks. And that is water. The lower backscatter is then in water, and the higher is land. But before we apply that, we segment it, which is also an open source automated method using the Slick SuperPixel. So all this is open source. That's one of the goals to keep this running, is to make it all open source. And then the fourth one shows that water, land, mask extent that was created. We have areas that we need to filter because they have a smooth surface, so they look like water, like a runway or other impervious surfaces. So we filter that out. We're also working on a similar method. We have it automated, but it's not as reliable for vegetation inundation. I think what I'm going to show is simplified here using the HH backscatter, but we've been looking at Shannon entropy and some other ways to make it a little bit more reliable. So here's the segmentation for that's completely automated, and it helps clean up the edges by segmenting first. And then there's the surface water extent map. So blue is the water. Then trying to look at those inundated areas that I mentioned before from the double bounce. Another way we can look at it is decompositions that you can do from the radar data. And so in this case, anything red would be double bounce. And then pulling just that double bounce out component out, you can produce maps. So this is one for May of 2017, and then July, August, October. And you really can't see any of that from optical data, which is shown here. And then we can combine all of those images from all the dates. I didn't show them all, but we have 11 dates of RadarSat-2 from this year, and you can map then combined where the surface water is, where it's always surface water without vegetation, that would be the dark blue. Where it's always land without standing water ever would be the yellow. And then in between are areas that are getting a little bit drier, or the vegetation, some of it, the vegetation, it was open water, but the vegetation comes in, like floating aquatic, and other places may dry out over the summer that were inundated previously. So looking at all the sites, we've done this, and thinking after, just before this started, I'm like, we've done this for all the years too, so I should have put in more years, but this was handy to throw in here. So this is the full area for the image for RadarSat-2 imagery of Bad River and Duluth, and then Whitefish Point, the Houghton site, and then just zooming in on the St. Louis estuary. You can see in a little bit more detail once you zoom in the hydro period for the different regions. So hopefully I'm doing okay on time here, but so the pros and cons of these different the backscatter is really dependent on that vegetation type. So, and C-band can't penetrate a dense forest canopy, so we can't get inundation under a swamp or a shrub, dense shrubby site, or it would maybe be patchy because you're not penetrating everywhere. It doesn't work under frag for the most part. Chenoplectus, when it's super sparse, when the water's really high, or floating aquatics can also be problematic. So we're looking at ways of maybe having different thresholds for different types. And then there's some confusion between agriculture and flooded vegetation. So those things would have to be masked out similarly to how we masked out impervious surfaces. We need to do more validation. A lot of our validation has been only in Lake St. Clair for this. And it's really kind of costly. So we looked into UAV, but we actually couldn't see past the vegetation with it, so that didn't work very well. And then we're working also on taking these methods that we developed for RadarSat-2 and making them work for other sensors, and in particular Sentinel. One is one because it's all on the cloud and it's all saved, that what's collected, and it's free. But looking at L-band for the future is another challenge that we'll be doing. And then this is just showing some field validation that we did for an area up in Northwest Territories. So an example of what we've done there, looking at the water to wetland edge and then the wetland to upland edge and trying to walk those edges. So it takes a lot of time and a lot of money. So from that, I wanted to go into the black tern breeding habitat monitoring, and this is the master's student project. She's been working with the National Audubon Society on this. They have data going back to 2013 for Lake St. Clair. And for those of you who don't know, it's a migratory shorebird, and it nests on the wetland edges in the freshwater wetlands. And there's been a 90% population decline since 1990, and they're concerned about the loss of available habitat, especially for nesting, due to development, as well as increases in Phragmites down in the area like Lake St. Clair, as well as shifting lake levels. So they're trying to identify the hazards and come up with some remediation strategies. Is it as simple as reducing the Phragmites in some of these areas, or is there a bigger issue? And one of the things they said is a lot of the chicks that do hatch are now being eaten, and they think maybe it's because the water levels are so high there that the fish can get in to deeper water. So she worked on this nest survival kind of model that used water depth and DVI from various sensors. And so this is just showing where the nests were in red in these 3 years and the failure probability based on NDVI and water depth. And you can see it's getting less and less, and the nests are getting less and less through the years. And so we actually ran into her out in the field a couple of times, and then she had contacted me. And so we started to work with her to see how we could maybe help with the radar. And we actually have imagery back to 2013. So maybe we could help with this study. So on the left is looking at the open water extent over all the years. So it's never open water is that orange color, and it's always is blue. And then the colonies are shown in white, the little polygons. So that's where they typically are known through the years to be nesting. And since these water levels have been increasing, on the chart on the bottom, the dashed line is showing the water level changes through time. And then each of the nests or the colonies are shown as the different colors in the bottom, and the open water fraction is what is showing for them. So what we're trying to do is see if we can help with some of the metrics to determine where they're nesting and where they're also having failures. So one of the things we looked at, and so I talked about this earlier about using the polarimetric radar sat data alone to map the vegetation types. So we don't have optical data for many years over from this time frame over this area. So being able to use the radar sat that we have, and we focused on peak growing seasons, July, to see what the different vegetation types were and what their habitat preferences and how it might be changing over time. So we found that it seems like they have preference to Chenoplectus, but now we're looking at what percentage of Chenoplectus versus open water, distance to open water, and what else might be around it to see if there's some predictor there. So this is kind of the preliminary stages of so right now this is just showing the 2018 map, and we're working on creating them for all the years to see how it's changing. And we should be able to see how the other species, plant species dominants are also changing around this region. So now I wanted to get into the Great Lakes connectivity modeling that's been going on. We did this originally just for the Lower Peninsula of Michigan, for the DEQ, Michigan's DEQ. And we were recently funded, I just started in January, to apply this to all of Lake Superior, both the US and Canada. So by definition, the coastal wetlands of the Great Lakes are directly influenced by the waters of one of the lakes or its connecting channels. And what we were doing is modeling what is inundated using DEM data and some other data sources, and then using wetland maps to determine which ones are coastal and which ones are not. And that changes through time with different water levels. So looking at both the 10-meter USGS NED, which is available for everywhere, but for most of Superior, we have 2-meter Lidar data. And so this is an example from the Duluth area, and then that data that is available for Superior. So what Mary Ellen leads this work, and she maps out the road and stream intersections and replaces those with a local minimum of a 5x5 window. She tested 8 different combinations of stream delineation to determine the best overall. And she found that the best was a slow breach that minimized changes to the dam, followed by a fast breach that broke through the remaining barriers in the very flat areas. And she did this all in white box, which is a Canadian tool. The breaching was then too extreme, so then she uses the local minimum to replace those artificially low values. And so this is an example, I think it's near Luna Pier. So on the right are the bridges and highways that you see in that box. And on the bottom is what, without any breaching, what the connectivity looks like. There's a gap with the roads, obviously. So we know that water is getting under there. So we need to she needed to figure out a way to breach those. So this is breaching to restore the connectivity. But in this case, you can see that it ends up going all the way out to this quarry, which we know it's not connected, but it was kind of overdoing it. So then she implements a local minimum filter to those breach streams, and that restores it to reasonable values. So you're no longer going all the way out to that quarry. She then used a time series of low, average, and high water levels. And for Michigan, Guy Meadows calculated surge levels for all the bays. So we were able to look at that as well. So she looked at the whole historical record to get those low, average, and high water levels. She then makes these inundation maps And here's shown the 10 meter on the top and the 2 meter on the bottom. So these dams are classified into average, high, and surge water inundation levels here. And then those inundation zones that are created are used to identify wetlands that can receive inflows from the Great Lakes, as well as areas that can become wetlands due to rising water levels. And so she intersects the coastal inundation map with the binational map that we have produced, which is available on this website. So many of you may know about this map, which actually built it over many years. The original one was just the coastal zone, 10 kilometers from the coast. And from various funding agencies, we filled the entire thing in and just completed it last summer. So it's all made in consistent method. But when you only go in 10 kilometers, some of these areas actually turn out to be connected far, especially in Saginaw Bay, through the connecting waters way further in. So it's good to have this map in order to be able to do that connection. So for Duluth, this is the 2 meter dam, and looking at, in this case, the average lake levels. So those are the wetlands that are on average based on the, I don't know, 80 or 90 year record are connected. And then at high levels, there's a few more. The other thing she looked at was looking at the 2 different dams and what happens. And so the 2 meter dam at high, this is again what was connected, and it's different for the 10. So it's not only less area, but it's also picking up differences, and that's just differences in the actual dam, and the resolution of it has a lot to do with that. So our next steps, she's scheduled to finish all of Superior, both the US and Canada, using that high resolution dam wherever possible for all of Lake Superior. And there's a validation and breaching involved, as well as manuscript she'll be writing. And then we'll also be looking at those high resolution maps that we've been producing. So we'll use those as well in the modeling of the pilot areas. And then this model is also used to understand those changes in inundation, and using that zone of inundation to look at wetland gain and loss, which the EPA is very interested in knowing. So we can reference that in relation to those lake level changes. So an example that we came up with for this, oops, oh, it is changing. So the map on the left should be switching between 2010 and 2018. So that 2010 map that I just showed you for the whole basin, we updated for parts of the area for 2018 that were heavily invaded by frag in 2010, and this was done for the USGS. And so using those two, we're able to apply the hydrologic modeling to determine which ones are coastal. And then using the high water of 2018, in this case, in this example, we're looking at what changed between those coastal wetlands that as defined by 2018 water levels. And this is, so this chart here is actually showing low, high, and average water levels and what's changing within those coastal wetlands. And a lot of it is water to wetland, you can see, as well as wetland to water. So those are just changes in water levels causing differences. There's also some wetland, emergent wetland to woody wetland. So some other changes going on. So in order to do this, this is what we first came up with, and open to debate or suggestions, but we had to come up with something. So we suggested tying that change to the lake level change and defining a change as either permanent or temporary. So a permanent loss would be loss to anthropogenic developed class, whereas a temporary is directly tied to the lake level change. So high levels at the coastline causing changes in water and emergent. And then a temporary gain will be a change due to high water levels, maybe at the upland wetland interface. whereas a permanent gain would be a change from an upland or developed class to a wetland. So this is how we define them. And then looking at this area that was mapped in both time periods, we have here listed what it would transition from and to between the 2 years. And when we do this, we get a map of permanent, temporary gains and losses. And the area modeled as inundated in 2018, which is what's shown here, shows an overall permanent wetland loss of almost 2,000 acres. So that's wetland going to urban or upland class. If you didn't separate it this way and just sum the numbers, looking at change in wetland, you actually gain 199 acres of wetland. So it's really important how you define this. I'm not saying that what we've done is perfect. So if anyone has any suggestions on how to do this, or whether we should be using high or maybe should be using surge or whatever water levels, that's still to be defined, but this is the beginning of this work. So just to summarize, the optical and radar imagery really together provide the best approach to monitoring both wetland type and change. It's really challenging, as I said, to make this more semi-automated, but we continue to explore it. And one thing is using domain adaptation, where you transpose data from one location to another using the radiometric data from the sensors. Surface water mapping from radar is automated. It's published. I think I forgot to point that out, but it was on the slide with our Canadian collaborators. And we have a high level of confidence in those products. The inundation extent is also automated, but we really need to tune it to those different cover types because we have some issues where we're not always penetrating the dense vegetation, and we're not always picking up necessarily with the thresholds we choose some of the really sparse vegetation. And we're using these right now with well, the DEQ, which is now Eagle, to help improve NWI updates. So knowing the hydro period is important to the NWI codes. So we can help with those, and L-band obviously would be even more helpful than the C-band data for the forested wetlands. And this hydrologic connectivity modeling should be complete by September for Superior. We continue to look for funding to model the entire basin, and so any sources that anyone is aware of, we would be happy to hear about. We're again looking for ways to improve assessment of wetland gain and loss, and but we acknowledge it must include that shifting zone of inundation. And we'll continue to apply our products for shorebird breeding habitat, but if we have data sets available for other threatened, endangered species, or some way that we can help, we're open to that. Although this current round of funding does end in September, so we'll be looking to try and continue this project. I did want to mention the partners from Minnesota, both Shared Geo and University of Minnesota. A lot of their focus has been on producing these digital surface models, which is different from a DEM or DTM, digital terrain model, which is giving you the ground. It's picking up vegetation. And so it can help in estimating vegetation height, as well as seeing storm damage within forests, and also with mapping different vegetation types. So that's just one of the things they're doing. And they do it for all of the image pairs back through time from worldview. And this is just kind of how this collaboration works. So we kind of have our hands in both the worldview and the SAR. So it's the Canadians and us doing the SAR work, and then Shared Geo, and is big on using the cloud computing and trying to get our algorithms automated and out there. And Minnesota is working a lot with e-cognition. And so I haven't presented their exact work today. We work with them, but they might be someone in the future that you might want to have present. We also have surveyed wetland managers, and that's on our story map if anybody's interested in reviewing that and giving some feedback. We take that seriously and we use that to determine the timing of these. Like, for example, the annual maps, that's what most people said was useful to them, not having them in different time periods, but just annually. So continue to work on this and QAing it. I think this is the story map with the link to it. And this goes through all these different features that I've shown, as well as the survey. And we will be in the next few months adding on to it what Shared Geo and Minnesota have been doing, as well as the Canadian collaborators. So with that, I'll stop, hopefully with some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Laura. Yeah, we've gotten a few questions, so we don't have much time remaining, but I will just kind of roll through these. I think some of them are quick ones. The first question we got was, what program or tool did you use to process and analyze these data? And is that a freely available or a licensed program?
So for processing it, for the radar, we use a few different tools, which are not, we use PCI, which is commercial, and Pulsar Pro, which is open source. And then we use Random Forest, which if anybody is interested in Random Forest, we have that in R and we can share that code. We've tweaked it specifically for wetlands. But that's pretty much what we use for all of the processing. And then write a lot of the code in Python, and for the automated ones, it's all been put into Python and open source tools. So that can be run easily.
Great, thanks. And someone else wrote, thanks for the great presentation. Maybe they missed it, but have you tried or been able to map reed canary grass? They saw that you included wet meadow. Would that potentially include reed canary grass?
It could, yeah. So we have not specifically tried to map that yet.
Okay. And some questions about the field methods. So what type of field validation methods do you use for vegetation types?
So we go to sites that are the minimum mapping unit of whatever we're, we tend to actually, for both of them, we go to the minimum mapping unit, which is a half an acre. So we typically set up a site that is 40 by 50 meters in size and characterize that. And we take photographs in all directions. We take some samples of vegetation density, write down plant types, and we've been using the same method for all of these. So it's consistent, but it's really important to collect it at your minimum mapping unit, because if you just have something smaller than that, and your pixels from the remote sensing is capturing something much larger, you have mixed things going on there that you haven't characterized in the field, and then that creates problems.
Great. And here's a question. I hope I don't botch it because I don't understand all the terminologies myself, but it says, have you looked at using Lidar point cloud for vegetation mapping? We are getting QL1 Lidar for Ashland County, which includes Bad River. And I think that came from Jim at Department of Administration here in Wisconsin.
So we haven't actually used that for doing vegetation type mapping. We have used it for like detecting vernal pools, doing some modeling there, but no, we haven't tried incorporating it yet.
Okay, maybe just one more. Why were the 2 meter and 10 meters selected as the inundation thresholds?
That was the 2 meter resolution DEM.
Oh, okay.
And that's the Lidar DEM. That's just the resolution of it. And then the 10 meter is the resolution of the USGS DEM that's available for the whole country. Okay. So that's why they were chosen. All
right, I think we got through a lot. If Thank you everybody for joining us. I don't know, Laura, we do have a couple more questions coming in if you are okay sticking around, or we can just
Yeah, I'm fine. And I don't know if I said it or if I said it to you, but yeah, if anybody has field data or knowledge of any of these sites that we haven't been to yet, we'd be glad to, really, really ecstatic actually to hear about them. And when we first did Duluth, we had some people who had collected field data, actually multiple sources, and they sent it to us. And between that and the high resolution images, we can usually create some polygons from that to help.
Awesome, great. Well, thank you everybody. I'm gonna jump into one question I see that I think came up for me as well, which is, are you collaborating with the Great Lakes Coastal Wetland Monitoring Program? And can you explain how you might be working with that group?
So actually, yeah, that group, we did get we did get some field data from them in the past, and I've actually been working with Dennis Albert. When we did Lake Chanot, we coordinated with him so that we collected different places than he did, so that we had more data. But we collaborate at that level, but also the map that I showed you of the whole basin. Where is it? This one, the one that was just the coastal zone. That was a collaborative project to the monitoring, the Great Lakes collaborative monitoring. So so I talk a lot with CMU and Don Uzarski, trying to coordinate things.
And to your point about maybe collaborating to get some of that field data, Jessica Strand wrote, is there, let's see, I copied the wrong thing here. If you contact directly with the Bad River staff, they can help you get data on that site. And so they're interested in chatting more about the project. So
okay, that's great.
Making that connection.